Okay, so hand-drawn assignment 3. Um, Let me see if I can pull it up here. Okay. Now I'll do a new share. Okay. And actually, I guess there's a little error up here. I don't think I'm going to fix it, but it should say graphing assignment number 3, not number 2. It's labeled number 3, so that's a little error. So for our purposes, and it's worth 31 points, and it's based on practice 18, number 1. That's the monopoly, and basically all it's asking you to do is look at the monopoly problem and go ahead and calculate the consumer and producer surplus and the total surplus and the deadweight loss for the monopoly, but compare it to an identical version of the problem. And this is the one you're gonna, construct on your own, which is, as if the monopoly was a competitive firm. So I'm going to stop sharing for a minute, and let's go to Ignition and take a look. Okay. So here's Ignition, and here's the homework quizzes 18, and here's number 1. So for the supply and demand graph, right, we would just be looking at that without the marginal revenue, right? So then you can go ahead and go from there. I will point out, and which might not be obvious, does anybody have an observation about the producer surplus in this particular situation?
I'm not sure. I'd have to review. I didn't do too well on this homework, but isn't the producer surplus going to be 0 because the marginal cost is flat?
Yeah, right. So that's kind of like under competition, right? You would have 0 producer surplus. Now, obviously, that's not going to be true under the monopoly version of the problem, right? Because the monopolist is going to earn profits, and that in this case, it's going to be a profit rectangle, and we looked at it before.
Yeah, I was about to ask. It would be the rectangle that's like down and to the left, right? That goes to like the
yeah. I kind of have it.
Yeah.
I kind of have it highlighted right now because I have the monopoly equilibrium.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So yeah, it goes above the marginal cost and to the monopoly price, and then it's based on the monopoly quantity, but there's a rectangle there. So yeah, under competition, there wouldn't be any producer surplus, but under monopoly there would be. So that's kind of like the little wrinkle. But otherwise than that, I think that the assignment is pretty straightforward. I don't know if you all have any questions, but you can obviously ask questions on Thursday when we get together Thursday. If you work on it between now and then. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at the next group of problems. So now we're down to this externalities and public goods. And so I can, obviously there are lectures on this, and I'll give you guys a really quick introduction here. and then you can ask questions. But basically, the idea is that an externality is a hidden cost of a market transaction, or sometimes it's a hidden benefit. So we have external costs and external benefits too. And the easiest case of external costs, and what they mean by external is that they're external to the decision maker. They fall on somebody else. They fall on a third party. And the easiest example is pollution. So you think about a business with a big smokestack, and they're making some product. Maybe they're generating electricity, and the consumers are using the electricity, and the producers producing the electricity. But then all of that smoke that comes out of the top of the smokestack, it falls on the people in the surrounding community. Who knows? You know, like sometimes in the case of electricity markets, there's a really good example of this, real world example. It's Arizona Public Service, which is the major electricity producer in Arizona. And most of the electricity production takes place far away from the major metropolitan areas like Phoenix or Mesa, Arizona. It takes place near the Grand Canyon, where there's a small population of people. And so, you know, it could be even the case that, you know, those people are using their own solar power, you know, because they're, you know, in a place where they get, you know, good solar or wind or something like that. And, you know, they're not even using the electricity that's being generated as a customer, but still all of that pollution. And there's a lot of pollution that comes from burning fossil fuels and doing other types of activities in agriculture. And, you know, this isn't a class about, you know, the quality of the environment, but it is something we study in economics quite extensively. And so I don't know if anybody needs any more examples, but basically the example is pollution that damages the health, and there might be other consequences. Like a lot of people don't know this. I don't know if you all have noticed. Have you ever noticed that in the fall, when, you know, around here it starts to rain, that usually your wiper blades are cracked and you need a new pair? Have you ever, anybody ever noticed that?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, that happens.
and you might think, oh well, it's just, you know, maybe because like it was hot over the summer and like somehow like the rubber got dried out or something like that. But normally what happens is that pollution levels from ozone. So ozone near the surface of the Earth is called, you know, tropospheric ozone, as opposed to stratospheric ozone, which is, you know, really high at the edge of the Earth's atmosphere. And there's no like mixing between them. The stratospheric ozone is its own thing. And a stratospheric ozone is actually a good thing, because ozone's a highly reactive molecule. And when it gets in the path of ultraviolet light coming from the sun, it actually reduces the amount of UV that comes to us on the ground. And so it has a protective effect. But because it's so reactive, when you end up getting tropospheric ozone, which is a byproduct of burning fossil fuels, and, you know, most importantly, right, the one that causes the most trouble is cars driving along in Los Angeles. And so we get these high ozone levels, and because ozone is so reactive, it literally is, you know, has a weak acid like effect, and particularly it reacts with rubber. So it causes rubber to crack. It'll cause your tires to wear down. And so my only point is that there's a lot of documented damage that comes from being exposed to pollution. It's not just in terms of the health effects on people, even though that's one of the most important ones. There, there are a lot of other damaging effects that generate costs for people that are exposed to pollution. So the point is that it generates an inefficiency in our market, because these costs are real costs to society, but they're not considered by the supplier, the producer, and by the consumers when they're interacting in the market and determine the market equilibrium price. So what happens is the market tends to overproduce. So here you see a shift in the supply curve, and what's going on is we're just adding on. See, it says here an external cost of $10 per unit, right? We're literally kind of like we did in the taxes, we're shifting the supply curve up to reflect that additional cost. And then we see there's a place where this shifted supply curve, which we're going to call, if we include all the costs of society, right? Remember that the supply curve of the private producers is their costs of production. So the social costs of production include not just the costs that the producers bear, but also the costs that are borne by other members of society. So if we add all the costs together, the private costs of the supplier plus these external costs, so we get this like true social cost curve. And we see that there's a place where the true social cost curve crosses with the demand curve. And we call that our socially optimal quantity of the good. So this is the true amount, and I'll get rid of the supply curve now. This is the socially optimal amount that should be produced. And so the thing that looks different here is now we end up, and so once you get to this point, this crossing point between the two of them, remember that the distance here is exactly 10 units. So it turns out that in this case, there's not a point on the original supply curve that corresponds to that same quantity, which is 13.75 units. But if you imagine there's a line that goes straight down there, then you can see there's this deadweight loss triangle that gets created by the overproduction as a result of the pollution. So this whole assignment is about looking at what would be socially optimal if all the costs were considered, and in particular noting that when there's an external cost, that if the market's left alone, it will inefficiently overproduce. And then comparing, what kind of losses in terms of, lost consumer and producer surplus and things like that will occur. So here's a case where we have an external benefit and it's 8 units. So notice that we're showing the external benefit on the demand side, not the supply side here. So in this question, it's the same sort of thing. And we didn't really talk about what would be called positive externalities or beneficial externalities. And those are more difficult to give examples of. If you read in your book and you listen to the lecture on it, this is kind of hard to think of. And so a lot of times I ask students, I'm like, hey, listen, okay, think about this. Can you think of anything that somebody does just because they want to do it, but you also end up getting some benefit from it? And it's normally hard to come up with examples that are good and concrete, like the pollution example, for a negative externality or a bad one, right? So do you guys have any ideas of like I said, the book gives some, and I don't think they're really like transparent and concrete. even though I'm not saying they're not important, the ones the book mentions, but there's probably one that's this probably the best example. Anybody? Nobody? Okay. So I'll ask you, Mitchell.
All right.
So can you think of something that somebody else does that gives a benefit to you that you don't have to pay for? Well, I'll give you the one in the book that I think is the best one. It's vaccinations. So like I get vaccinated for COVID, right?
Yeah.
And even if you don't, right, I'm less likely to transmit the disease to you,
But
right?
couldn't you say I still kind of paid for that? Like the US government says nobody's paying for it, but that's just because they're paying
Oh,
for it and I pay taxes to them. So
okay.
indirectly, to me, I did pay for it.
Okay. Yeah.
They're just saying
Okay.
it's included now
No,
in your
no, 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 no,
taxes.
no. Okay. Well, you're kind of mixing things up a little bit, right? Because
Okay.
that's actually our reason for subsidizing vaccines is because they do generate a positive externality.
Oh yeah, don't get me wrong. They're
Right,
100%
right,
worth it. I just don't
right.
say it's free. I say it's worth the little bit of cost that we're going to put into it.
Yeah. No.
But
But
are we
I
just
want to
saying
say,
the action of like you going and getting
yeah.
the
I mean,
vaccine?
yeah. Suppose that we were in a system where everybody pays for their own vaccine, no subsidies, but I get one.
Yeah, that benefits me.
That benefits you, right? So
Yes.
there is this external benefit because you're less likely to get COVID because I was vaccinated. You know what's really interesting, and I don't even know that this is a great example anymore because if you all have been, just go on Google and you know, I've only heard a few people mention this. There was an international vaccine expert that was on Bloomberg that was giving an interview. But what you'll notice is, like, for example, in California today, um, the data from yesterday, because they delay reporting, like you have to be at the end of the day to report like how many new coronavirus cases you had yesterday, right?
Yeah.
Um, so if you look on Google, then you do California coronavirus cases, you have two options. One is to look at new cases, and the other one is to look at deaths. And what you'll see is that through most of the pandemic, before vaccinations and some herd immunity stuff, were before vaccinations were available. I just say it that way, though I'm not saying vaccinations are the only way that people acquire immunity. But there was a direct link between the number of people that were getting coronavirus and the number of people that were dying. Okay. But now the two have started to diverge, which means, so yesterday in all of California, we only had 12 deaths from coronavirus. That was the data I looked at this morning. But there were 2,578 cases reported in the state, right? Which isn't a lot. I mean, that's a lot less than it used to be. But if you look at the graphs, you'll see that the what maybe I can actually show you guys.
Are you
Just
just
for
trying to say that the number of cases is still kind of high, but the deaths have gone down drastically? Is that what
yeah,
you're getting?
yeah,
Well,
yeah.
yeah, but isn't that what was expected? Because the none of the vaccines are supposed to stop you from getting it. They're just supposed to keep you out of the hospital if you do.
Well, okay, yeah, that's a good point. But there's even a little bit better point. So hold on a minute and let me do. Can you guys see my screen for California coronavirus cases right now?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so this is Google. Okay, so look
But
at this.
that might be. Oh no,
This is
never.
this is April 19th, right? That's the last data point. See 2,375. Oh no, 2,557 new cases. Now look at, so you can see this, like it goes up, there's the wave, and then it kind of flattens out, right? But it's not going down dramatically. But look at the deaths. Okay. That's not getting flat at the end, right? It keeps going down, right? And so, yeah, so can you see yesterday there were only 12 deaths in the whole state from coronavirus, right?
Yeah.
Now, part of the explanation for that is that people who have been vaccinated are still getting coronavirus. Okay. And that's the thing that the vaccine expert said, and it goes together with your point, Mitchell, is that even though the vaccine confers some protection against the severity of the disease, it doesn't mean that you can't get infected and shed virus and potentially infect someone else, right?
Yeah.
So it was also kind of interesting because my wife and I, there's this doctor we know that we were talking to, and he was working in the hospital during this whole COVID thing, and there were lots of people that were asymptomatic. And so he said, whenever anybody was admitted to the hospital for whatever, a broken leg, they come in because they're pregnant and they're ready to give birth, they would just give them a COVID test just to see if they needed to be isolated by themselves or something like that. And he's like, you'd be surprised how many people we had coming into the hospital who had no symptoms or whatever, but we just gave them the coronavirus test and they tested positive, and then we had to end up isolating them, right? So my point is that, yeah, I think that the data shows the pandemic is basically over with, but you're going to see this continuing tail of like 2,000-3,000 cases a day for probably a while, because people are going to be doing random stuff like going someplace to the hospital because they broke their leg or whatever, and they've been vaccinated and they're not in any distress, but they just test them out of routine for COVID, and then it gets reported to the state. But if you look at the deaths, you're like, oh, well, look, all those people that are infected, they're not having severe illness. They're not dying. They're not really getting sick because they've been vaccinated or they have some immunity. But I guess the point that I was making for us, because I thought it was an interesting point, is, yeah, sure, I get vaccinated, I'm less likely to infect you probably because of that, right? But what's the real benefit? Because if I can still, I get infected, but I don't get severe disease, right? And I don't die, and I don't go to the hospital because I'm not in distress, then but I could still give COVID to you, Mitchell. Is there really a benefit you get? Again, assuming that we all pay for our own vaccines, but I get vaccinated, is there a real tangible benefit to you, even if I can still infect you?
I mean, I'd say you're still a participating member of society as a whole. So probably, like
Well,
just
okay.
I'm
Draw it
not
up.
sure.
Yeah, well, I think the real benefit is a lot of people, when they thought about the COVID crisis, and I don't know that there were lots of rational heads around, but the biggest problem with COVID wasn't that so many people were dying, it was that so many people were dying at the same time. So we overwhelmed the healthcare system. And I don't know about you, but I had people that I knew that were scheduled for like routine procedures like colonoscopy or heart surgery or whatever, but they couldn't go to the hospital because the hospital was overwhelmed with COVID patients. So, if
I
I get,
experienced that firsthand, just
oh,
tossing that out
did
there. That
you?
was, yeah, in late December, I ended up needing back surgery, but I was in and out of the ER like 5 times because they're like, we don't want to keep you here. Like, we need the
Right.
bed. So they just drug me up and sent me home.
Yeah. So it's that kind of thing that if I get vaccinated and I'm not at the hospital clogging it up, and you get a broken leg or get in a car accident or something like that, you're more likely to survive because you can get access to services that would be strained if there were a bunch of people that were unvaccinated like me overwhelming the healthcare system if I hadn't gotten vaccinated. So yeah, I still think that it's more indirect, right? And I do think that it's probably this vaccine expert, even though he was saying that people that get vaccinated can still get COVID and they can still transmit COVID. I imagine the truth of the matter is that the course of the disease itself is probably attenuated, meaning that your infectious period is probably shorter. You probably don't shed as much virus. You probably, even though you could infect someone else, you're probably less likely to.
Yeah,
Um,
well, as a physics major, I enjoyed looking at all the numbers on it, and a lot of
yeah.
the problem is they just didn't test for that kind of stuff because they were in a hurry. So there does seem to be correlations, though, from what I've seen, between like getting vaccinated and your ability to spread it.
Oh, you mean that you're less likely to spread it
Yeah,
if you've been vaccinated? Yeah. I think that's probably true. And not only that, but I also think it's a good idea to be vaccinated because you're much less likely to get severely ill and overwhelm the healthcare system that all of us rely on. So yeah, there are these benefits from being vaccinated for communicable diseases that do justify, and this is what you'll see is so here, notice that the demand curve is the private willingness to pay for like something like vaccination. But because other people benefit too, right? We add that external benefit to the willingness to pay of the private party, and we get a total social benefit curve here. And then what we can see is that whereas private parties would only considering themselves the vaccine supplier or the vaccine demand would stop at here at 16.6 units. Once you consider all the benefits to society, the true socially optimal amount of vaccine in this case would be 18.2 units. So the social optimum is higher than the private optimum when there is a positive externality. So this is a negative externality. We overproduce. Positive externality, we underproduce. And then we get to the next part, which is what you were talking about, which is how do we correct that? So the part that I like about this topic in the class is that most of the class, in my opinion, can be summarized as the government is bad, 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 right? The class tells you how taxes and price controls and quantity regulations, in the absence of other considerations, just decrease the social well-being of society as we measure it with total surplus. But here, you can see there is a role for the government to do something constructive and actually increase the amount of total surplus, because in the case of a negative externality, we need some way to be able to introduce a cost to reflect the true cost of society. So what your book will tell you about is normally this is where economists will say, oh, we should add a pollution tax so that social cost curve actually shows up. And so it's a justification for taxing things like fossil fuel. And if you think about, I don't know if you guys have heard about like sin taxes, meaning sin isn't like doing a bad thing, associated with alcohol and tobacco. But there's a good economic argument that a sin tax, unlike a regular tax, is actually increasing efficiency, because people that drink also drink and drive, and they create these additional risks for people driving. And so you want less of that activity. And one way to get less is to tax, right? So, and down here where you've got this external benefit, again, there's this role for the government to not tax, but add a subsidy. And a subsidy would shift the demand curve up. For example, if you subsidize vaccines, then you get more people getting vaccinated. So that's what this whole section is about. And so let's see, the external cost of 5. Oh, what's the deadweight loss? Okay, so here's again a deadweight loss one. And this is where you want to be careful because the triangle here is like really small and you have to kind of draw it on your own because there's not a point associated with it on the red supply curve. Okay. And let's see. Oh, and this is one asking about a corrective tax. And here, the corrective tax would just be equal to the size of the external cost. So I don't know, we can put it in and see what it comes out at, but yeah, just 9. Okay. And a corrective subsidy, again, would be equal to the size of the external benefit. So I don't know. So yeah. And then this one is just a multiple choice. And you really have to watch the lecture. I go through these things in detail over, because again, there are examples from your book that will talk about, what are particular types of externalities that economists have studied and are now used as part of policy. And you'll be able to from that select which of the multiple choice options is best. But that's just a quick overview of the assignment and a little bit of discussion about the third hand-drawn assignment. And that's all I really have for you guys today. So I'm gonna stop the recording.